The Middle East is a quagmire, complex and dynamic in nature. Hundreds of thousands have died and many more wounded. Conflict after conflict has forever altered the region, the subject of intrigue for many superpowers globally. War, devastation, authoritarianism, terrorism, corruption. These are just some of the few words used to describe the Middle East today. But why is this the case? Why is the region so volatile? And why is there a lack of context behind why the region is so complex? In this video, let's examine why democracy in the Middle East doesn't work. Historically, the Middle East was a diverse assortment of different Arab tribes as part of either the Ottoman Empire or a particular European empire like the British or French. When these empires eventually collapsed in the early 1900s, several independent states propped up across the region, and the tribes within these now independent countries began fighting amongst themselves for complete control over their country. When dividing up the region for colonization purposes, both France and Britain failed to consider territorial areas specific to certain tribes over others. As a result, many distinct tribal areas were divided along borderlines to separate French and British colonies. These geographic divisions lay the initial seeds for war once these countries gained independence from European rule. Countries like Iraq consisted of a mix of different Islamic sects, including Sunni Arabs and Kurds, Shia Arabs, and Yazidis. Meanwhile, Iran was mostly Shia, while Saudi Arabia was primarily Sunni. Sunnis and Shias have some fundamental disagreements. Following the death of Muhammad, he left behind no wish as to who his heir should be. The Sunnis are an Islamic sect consisting of followers of the Prophet who believed that a member of Muhammad's elite group of followers should replace him as heir. Meanwhile, the Shiites were a smaller group of followers who believed that his heir should be a family member, namely Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law Ali. The Sunnis won out, but this dispute laid the foundation for today's well-known Sunni-Shia split. Following the end of Europe's colonial venture in the region, numerous kings and authoritarians alike took control over these newly formed independent states. For instance, in Saudi Arabia, the Al Saud tribe fought a vicious civil war against other tribes, eventually bringing it to power. Unlike Europe, the Middle East does not have a rich history of flourishing democracies. Democracy is primarily a European concept, specifically Greek, and is ingrained within the European psyche. Therefore, to topple the existing power structures in the Middle East is a recipe for disaster, breeding nothing but chaos and instability. Why? Because the numerous authoritarian dictatorships that were formed in the region's countries are a byproduct of various contextual factors pertaining to the specific country in question. For example, historically, Iraq's ethnic composition meant that many of its various Islamic sects were prone to violence against each other. The corresponding precariousness lay fertile ground for Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party to seize power. While Saddam launched numerous ethnic cleansing campaigns against the Sunni Arabs in southern Iraq and the Sunni Kurds in northern Iraq, his primary aim was to consolidate and maintain his grip on power. The brutality of his actions kept Iraq's numerous sects together, largely preserving the territorial sovereignty of the country. By toppling Saddam, many of the prior hatreds and disputes between Iraq's various sects began to simmer, resulting in the sectarian violence we continue to see today. While I by no means support Saddam or any of his actions, it is important to note that ISIS would not be roaming the streets of Mosul if he was in power. So yes, given Iraq's context, Saddam served a particular purpose. Think of it this way. Whenever a leader or group of people rise to power, it is often due to deep underlying issues within a country. The ensuing chaos, instability, provides a breathing ground for certain political or religious factions, including extreme ones, an environment to foster. And if the situation is dire enough, these extreme factions, whether we like them or not, rise to prominence and do win a considerable amount of either popular support or otherwise willing compliance. This is observed not only in the Middle East, but even in Western nations. Look at Nazi Germany. Hitler came to power primarily through exploiting the legitimate economic grievances of working-class Germans. many of whom suffered financially due to the war reparations Germany had to pay post-World War I, coupled with the Great Depression. There was also a feeling of resentment brewing against Britain, France, and other European nations. Many Germans felt that the sovereignty of the country was beholden to foreign forces. Thus, a need to reclaim nationalist pride and strength in the face of foreign opposition simmered amongst the public. The Nazis based their ideology and policy manifesto on these grievances, subsequently winning popular support and forming government. Having said this, it is important to add that while demagogues rise to power to fulfill a particular purpose, once this purpose is fulfilled, they are naturally removed from power, usually by the people. Now, there are numerous examples of this. Look at Egypt. During the Arab Spring of 2011, Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak was removed from power after months of civil unrest. The widespread protests were the result of poor living standards and high prices for electricity, food, and other living expenses. With government corruption at an all-time high, the protests at Egypt's Tahrir Square demonstrate the power of collective public action against an authoritarian figure. Another example is Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. For reasons like that of Egypt, he too was toppled by his own people. Look at Tunisia's Ben Ali, once again removed from power by his own citizens. Of course, I do note that both Libya and Egypt continue to face insurmountable challenges. Libya entered a second civil war after the first, which removed Gaddafi. Meanwhile, Egypt is currently run by a military general who many perceive is worse than Mubarak. But still, case in point, a leader rises to power for certain reasons, and once his purpose is fulfilled, he is removed. Think of it like the country is being cleansed in a way, renewed through a revolution of some sort. With consistent failures to establish effective, well-functioning democracies in Libya, Iraq, and Egypt, and of course ongoing civil wars in Syria and Yemen, it begs the question, is democracy really that viable in the Middle East? For the most part, no. Except for Tunisia, every other country that has participated in the venture, that is, becoming a democracy, has largely failed. Why? Because democracy isn't historically a Middle Eastern ideal. When democracies initially began to spread across Europe, it mainly provided men the right to vote. From then on, the concept developed, providing new rights and freedoms, whether it be human rights and the abolishment of slavery, freedom of speech and religion, as well as free and fair elections. Eventually, women were given the right to vote, and so on. Do you see how this initial ideal evolved with many Western nations, and in doing so became embedded within the Western psyche? Many Middle Eastern countries simply do not have this evolutionary experience with democracy. As a result, countries like Iraq, Libya, and Egypt have had to adopt this concept, import it from foreign nations, and somehow implement it locally. An uphill task given the incongruency in context. Over the years, constant foreign intervention is also disrupting the region. Geopolitical proxy wars between the US and the USSR have exacerbated tensions, directly affecting who in turn comes to power in the region. For example, in the 1950s, Iran had a well-functioning democracy, but the nation's popular PM, Mohammad Mossadegh, was removed through a coup launched by the CIA. Why? Because he was too close to the Soviet Union. America feared that if he was too aligned with the USSR, they would be able to spread communism across the region. Following his removal, the US propped up a dictator, Reza Shah, who turned the country into a Western-backed secular monarchy. Shah was eventually toppled during the Iranian Revolution of 1980, which turned the country into a radical theocratic Islamic state in complete opposition to the US. Looking back, it would have probably been better if America did not interfere in the first place. Then there is the invasion of Afghanistan by the USSR in the 1980s. To prop up a Soviet puppet regime in Kabul, the USSR fought a brutal war against the Mujahideen, a group of Islamic tribal fighters, who eventually defeated the Soviets thanks to US military weapons support. However, following the removal of the Soviets, numerous factional warlords within the Mujahideen fought their own civil war. One of the factions, the Taliban, won out and took over the country in 1996. In doing so, Afghanistan became a haven for terrorists and terror networks like Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. The group has alliances across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and is responsible for the deaths of thousands worldwide. These are just some of the indirect consequences of military intervention in disrupting this region. Therefore, whether it be geographic boundaries within tribal areas, contextual reasons behind authoritarianism and revolution, or constant foreign interference, democracy is difficult to administer in the complex, sophisticated region that is the Middle East.